Thank you all for being here despite the weather and the time. I hope I will not only entertain you visually, but also to give you some food of thought. I'm going to talk about the challenge of understanding drug violence in Mexico. The wave of violence has been ravaging the country for the last few years. Starting in 2007, we can count for 150,000 people being killed in the country. I'm a conflict scholar. People who study political violence, especially civil wars, have a definition of a civil war counting 1,000 people getting killed in a year. The kind of violence that we see in Mexico is equivalent to having the onset of 150 civil wars occurring in just this very short period of time. Why is that happening? Why do we see this very massive escalation of violence? Especially in a country, well, yeah, you can trace back criminal organizations, drug trafficking groups in Mexico for decades, but they were not performing their activities in such a violent way. What explains this change of behavior? That is some of the things that I want to discuss with you today. We can analyze many different factors. The usual suspects come at the macro level. What are those elements? Well, one of those usual suspects is consumption, drug consumption in the U.S. With only 5% of the global population, the U.S. consumes about 25% of all the illicit drugs. This calls for a huge, enormous, profitable market. Selling drugs is something very, very profitable for these organizations, and they are willing to kill and die for. There are some people who say, well, actually the use of drugs is declining in the U.S. But when you break the information down some specific populations, you can actually see an increase in the levels of consumption. So it's not very clear what the trend is. But what we know is this is a very, very, very valuable market, and it's giving people, criminals, very good incentives to conduct this kind of illicit activities. Another suspect, shifting routes. Usually, criminal organizations, let me see how this works, were producing drugs down here, and they were taking the Caribbean route. With international efforts of the U.S. trying to block this route with the South American Task Force, the Southcom force, is basically monitoring all this area and making it harder for criminals to use just islands just to hop from one to another one. So you go to Miami, you know that TV series Miami Vice. It was all about this route. Now things are changing. With U.S. monitoring the area, that increased the strategic value of Mexico because they cannot go this route anymore. They have to go to Mexico, deliver inland, and then make their way up on land until the border. So drugs enter this huge profitable margin. So that increased the strategic value of the Mexican territory and empowered criminal organizations. Now they're taking a bigger share of transporting costs to the U.S. by taking a lot more money from Colombian criminal groups that are also being cracked down. So we have international drug markets and also international routes. Those are big, large-scale factors. We also have another very important factor that is also international. From 1994 to 2004, there was a federal enforced ban on assault weapons in the U.S. The federal government prevented many of these armed producers to produce assault weapons. Assault weapons are military kind, multiple magazine weapons that you can use for an army. These are AK-47s, R-15s, M50 caliber anti-tank or anti-aerial weapons. So in 2004, that ban expired, and all this industry started producing lots of guns. We went from 13 million automatic assault weapons being produced to almost 22 million in just a matter of a few years. In 2008 and 2009, the U.S. government, the ATF, had this gun running project, the Fast and Furious project, basically intendedly smuggling 2,000 assault weapons to Mexican cartels, basically to trace down how they operate in the smuggling drugs, in the smuggling guns. These 2,000 weapons got lost. They were nowhere to be found. The scandal broke when cartels killed an American citizen. Actually, he was a DNA agent in Mexico, and in Mexico they are not allowed to have guns, to carry guns. So he was basically vulnerable to an attack of criminal organization. He got killed, and in the crime scene, one of these guns emerged. So this is a problem. Drugs are going north, and at the same time, guns are going down. This is a typical picture of an arsenal. Look at all the different kind of high caliber weapons that criminals have. Just these 5 guys carrying all that huge arsenal. This is a picture of the Mexican army putting a sign on the border, the Mexican border towards the US, saying, please, no more guns. Of course, when you try to talk about this in the US, it triggers many ideological and political mechanisms that is very hard to discuss the consequences of international smuggling of guns down to Mexico. It's not only that you need to kill someone, you need motivation, also a person doing that, and also the technology to do that. And in this way, there's a huge supply of weapons from the US to Mexico that are in the hands of criminal organizations that definitely outgun local municipal police forces with just a 22 caliber pistol. When they face very hardly armed death squads, they have no chance in winning the battle. Despite the massive law enforcement sustained for 60 years pretty much in Latin America and worldwide, the big idea of these efforts is to reduce the supply so much that you increase the prices of these illicit products, and they're so expensive that no one can afford them. That's the idea of making any good illegal. And the consequence is to make the prices so high that nobody can afford them. Well, unfortunately, we see different trends. These are the prices of heroin from 81 to 2007, different volumes of shipments. The prices are declining despite the massive law enforcement. If the intention is to reduce the supply to make the prices high, the prices are going down. So the theory is falling. The economics theory is falling apart in these illicit economic markets. That is the problem with heroin. The same happens with crack. Crack is getting cheaper as much as heroin, and also with cocaine. Cocaine prices are going down. And when you measure this, not only with the number, the amount of money that you pay for drugs, when you pair that with the purity, drugs are getting more clean, purer, more powerful by cheaper prices. So in the overall, these large law enforcement are failing in fulfilling the objective of reducing the consumption by increasing the prices and the supply. So we have all these international factors. But these are large-scale moving elements that affect not only the entire country, but the entire region. And that actually does not explain the very rapid variation of conflict that we see in Mexico. If these things happen for many years across the region, then you will expect to see this increase of violence in many other countries. And this is just happening in Mexico in this particular way. Some other countries in Central America, they have their own different issues explained by different factors. So these large-scale international factors do not explain the entire picture. We have a lot more leverage to explain. So we have to focus on some domestic factors. There are also some things that, well, the usual discourse of the Mexican government is like, blame the U.S., right? This is not a Mexican problem. No, of course, there are some things that are going on in Mexico that are creating a problem. One of them is definitely poverty. About 43% of the Mexican population lives below the poverty line. At the same time, we have the wealthiest man in the world, Carlos Slim, actually wealthier than Bill Gates. So you have not only a large amount of poverty, but also huge inequality. On top of that, the economic recession in the U.S. created a lot of unemployment in Mexico. This is the economic recession in the U.S. 2008, and in 2009, we see a spike of unemployment. To kill someone, you need motivation. That comes from these very valuable markets. You also need technology. That comes from guns. And you also need people. If you have no job, and you can get a lot of money by dealing drugs or being a security guard for the drug shipment, well, that's the only way you can get some food for your family. And unemployment definitely facilitates recruitment. When you have street gangs, these kids have no education or opportunities to get a job. And when you have this massive international economic crisis that is hitting Mexico so badly, you see lots of people unemployed, and that becomes a human reserve for criminal organizations to easily recruit. So it's becoming a perfect combination of many different international factors, but also domestic factors that the Mexican economy cannot provide for any opportunities for many of these young fellows. There are also some specific characteristics of some territories that might help to explain the strategic value of controlling those areas. You can think of reception areas along the Pacific shore of drugs coming from South America through the Atlantic, through the Pacific, sorry. These territories themselves are valuable because of their geographic position. The same can be said from drugs coming from the Caribbean route and making their way in through the Mexican Gulf. Also, there's a very valuable strategic territory of controlling the border. If you control the border, then you can control the entry points to this huge market. Also, there's drug production in Mexico. Controlling these areas is going to give you access to all the profits of poppy and marijuana that eventually will make their way up. So there are some domestic factors, geographic factors that make some territories more prone to violence than others. All these areas are more prone to violence than somewhere in the middle of the country, where you don't have these strategic territories. Also, politics come into a play. For 70 years, Mexico had a single party dominating the political scenes from the executive at the presidency, the Senate, the lower house, pretty much all states and all municipalities. That created a situation called the Mexican Pax Mafiosa, which is a political agreement in which you make a deal with maybe the president, a few generals, and maybe a handful of governors, and then you control the entire hierarchical structure. So you can do your business dealing drugs internationally without creating violence. That worked out fine for 70 years. Part of this corrupt alliance between Mexican politicians at different levels and criminal organizations. One of the problems is that you have democracy. We all want democracy, right? We have better politicians, clean, they are not colluded with these criminal organizations, and that's good. But that actually eroded this political structure of Mexican politicians having an alliance with criminal organizations. This is a figure of decline of vote share of the PRI, which is the solid line. They decline the level of political support to the extent that eventually they lost the presidency. At the extent of having more democratic and active political parties that eventually created this transformation of the political scene. That was good for Mexico of having democracy, but that eroded this pact of stability between criminals and politicians. That happened for the presidency, also the Congress. This is the percentage of votes at the lower house, and also at the municipal level. The solid line is the number of municipalities controlled by opposition. So in a matter of few years, basically 10 years, the Mexican scene completely changed by democratization, not only at the federal level, but at local and subnational levels. So you have now many different political actors. If you're a criminal, before you only need to make a pact with a few governors, and that was it. Now you have to make pacts with a bunch of mayors, a bunch of governors, and maybe senators, and then you have to renew those pacts every election. So the cost of making a pact is a lot more expensive, and the duration of those pacts shortens with every election. So democracy eroded these criminal pacts between politicians and criminal organizations. Also, there was something very important in the 2006 election. Having 70 years of party dominance, most of that dominance happened through electoral corruption and rigging the elections. So in Mexico, there's like this huge fear of having electoral fraud. In 2006, the incoming president, Felipe Calderón, won the election by less than 1%. It was such a narrow election, it was pretty much tight end. Well, a lot of people call that electoral fraud. You know, you can reach just a little bit, well enough to make you win by less than 1%. A lot of people went to the streets to protest against electoral fraud. That created a crisis, a political crisis for the incoming president who needed to do something. He had a governance crisis. And the way he did it was to call the army. A very well-known effect of rally around the flag. When you have a political crisis, well, a really good strategy is to create violence. Call the army, which is the most respected institution in Mexico, make the president look like a very strong leader, call these criminals a scapegoat because nobody wants to put their hands on the fire for them, and the president will be providing a public good of security by cracking down on them. So there were also these very conjunctural elements of Mexican politics that called for a very large move against criminal organizations. The problem of security was not an issue during the campaigns in 2006, but right after the president took the position, he swore to the Constitution, the immediate act was to move to the largest military base and announce a large-scale crusade against criminal organizations by taking the army out from the barracks to crush criminal groups. He basically took all the military effort and the coercive apparatus of the state and pointed it against criminal organizations. That created a very disruptive effect. So you have not only international factors, but domestic factors. But still, this is not explaining the wide variation of violence. Why are some areas becoming so violent so rapidly and neighboring areas not being contagious so far? So there's a lot of variation that we still need to explain. To do that, we have to look at the micro level, the microdynamics of violence. If you watch a boxing fight, well, you have to you have to look at the two different contenders, not only look at the criminals, just one contender. You need to look at the interaction of the different contenders when you try to understand a political or violent conflict. If you try to do that, you can go and try to get some data from the Mexican government. And then this is when the problems start. The Mexican government did not measure anything until 2007. So if you want to measure something, you need data here. The Mexican government has no data, as if the problem didn't exist before, right? Which is ridiculous. Also, there's a problem with just focusing on homicide data. A dead body is just a dead body. You don't know who this person was. You don't know who killed that person. So you don't have any idea about the victim or the perpetrator. Also, when you just focus about homicides, you ignore all the different types of violence that do not end in someone getting killed. There can be some clash in the center of in the downtown for hours, throwing grenades at each other, and if no one dies, then that is not recorded here. Another problem is not the same thing of just putting a bullet on someone's chest than just chopping down the body, dragging it to the streets, hanging the body from a tree for everyone to see. The strategic and the brutality use of violence is also something very meaningful that is not captured with just body counts and homicide data. So there are lots of methodological problems which just rely on official data from the Mexican authorities. To provide an alternative for that, I use a different approach, which is the event data approach. An event is basically a set of information that tells you about someone, that is the source, doing something, that is the action being conducted, to someone else. That is the target of the action. You also put a date and a location to that. This will give you a lot more information when you try to get, for example, some more nuanced perspectives of the police arrested, killed, seized. There are many things that the police can do. Against whom? Criminal organizations. Okay, what kind of criminal? Drug smuggler at the low level or the kingpin? Or the head of the killers, the assassins, called jefe de sicarios, the head of the killers. You can also analyze the different kind of violence that the criminals are conducting against the state. Are they killing, kidnapping? If they kill, do they mutilate or not? So there are like all these horrible and brutal nuances that you can get by analyzing more fine-grained data in a kind of event database. So to do this, I developed a software because it was like too much work and I had to graduate in doing my PhD program. So you have to do something, right? So I developed a software that reads newspapers in Spanish, basically taking 105 different sources from January 1st of 2000 to December 31st, 2010, pretty much 11 years calendars, covering all the municipalities of the country using local press, national level newspapers, also government reports from the Army, the police, the Navy, and also local police offices. So pretty much all the information I could gather, it was too much to read for just one graduate student or maybe an army of research assistants. So I developed this software that reads the newspapers and identifies the police arrested a drug dealer. The army seized um, um, an arsenal, or a death squad kill a former major. So you can get all these different tactics of who's doing what to whom, when, and where. It was too much information, so in order to make sense of it, I assembled and aggregated it into 3 different variables. The one that I call law enforcement, which are all the different tactics that the state can do against DTOs, that's drug trafficking organizations, against criminals. And those can range from violent ones to non-violent tactics that the state can do, because the state can pull many triggers, right? Also, retaliation. This is violence from criminals against the state. Who are they targeting? The police at the federal, local level, majors, military. How are they going after the state? And most importantly, what I call competition, this is violence among criminal organizations with the state, where the state is not involved. This is about criminals clashing against each other. So all this came about reviewing all the municipalities of the country for about 11 years calendar. That came about almost 10 million observations of who did what to whom, when, and where in Mexico at the daily municipal level, using a variety of actors with a variety of tactics against different types of rivals. To understand this, we need not only data, we also need a theory. What is going on? What is explaining this escalation of violence in Mexico? And the theory that I have is that the state, by acting against criminals, is creating opportunities for violence among criminal organizations. And this is how it works. The state uses law enforcement, weakens this criminal group by taking down the leadership, by actually going after them. It's signaling to others that these criminal groups are not longer protected by corruption pacts, so they're weaker because they're not protected anymore by this corruption. And this is going to trigger some violent reactions from criminals against the state. This is the usual two-way conflict that we usually see in political violence. But by cracking down this criminal organization, that's going to create an opportunity for the rival to invade. If these guys are weak, and if their territory is so valuable, now is the time to move in, wipe them out, kill them all, so we can control this territory. If there is still some resistance, these guys are going to fight back, the invaders. So the state action is going to create territorial conflict among criminal organizations. If the state is doing that also against this organization, then this one is also vulnerable now. When the state is going after all criminal organizations, at the same time launching this large-scale crusade against crime and being tough on drugs, then it not only creates a bunch of violence against the state, but mostly among rival criminal organizations competing for territory. So this is pretty much a recipe of disaster. When the state is going after everyone systematically without a clear strategy of who targeting first, then it's creating this large escalation of violence, most importantly against or among criminal organizations, not that much against the state. It's pretty much a conflict among criminals. And that's what you see as the huge escalation of violence. But the key trigger is the state disrupting the balance among criminal organizations that creates all these opportunities for territorial turf. Okay, let's take a look at the data. These are the main trends. The blue line is violent law enforcement. Basically, the events where I identify the state forces of different levels wounding or killing criminals. You see this starting the spike in 2007 when Calderon launched the army against them. The state is being increasingly more violent, using the use of lethal force against criminals. The green line is how criminals react against the state. People who study counterinsurgency, they will say, well, once you send the US in Afghanistan, well, that's going to deter the Taliban. That's the usual rationale. Because it's so powerful that it's going to depress the reactions, the violent reactions of the rivals. In this case, criminal organizations are a lot more violent to the state than what the state is doing to them. So basically, for one event of violence that the state is conducting against them, they fight back twice or more than that, because they have all these weapons that the local police does not have. But most importantly, we see this very large spike of violence, which is the competition violence, the red line, of violence among criminal organizations. So the bulk of the conflict is not the state against criminals, it's not criminals against the state. The big picture of drug violence in Mexico is criminals against criminals fighting for territorial control. That is the big important consequence of all these little escalations of violence from the state, is creating all this mess among criminal organizations. But violence is not the only thing that the state is doing against criminals. The state is largely relying on arrests and seizures, which also affect the number of people that these organizations have for conducting their illicit activities and also for protecting their territories. So these elements are also going to have a lot of disruptive effects. In the analysis that I conduct, state violence is the most disruptive force, creating violence among criminal organizations, and these other non-violent means also have some positive effect, but less pronounced. But they're also creating violence among criminal organizations. Let me show you this. This is a heat map of violence among criminal groups. And you will see the evolution over time. At the beginning, just Juarez and Nuevo León, here, 2001. The usual suspects of violence were happening here. This is Tijuana. This is Sinaloa. This is Jalisco, Michoacán. So you see slowly the spread of violence in some contagious points. But it was in 2007 when Calderón launched the army to fight them that you really see the escalation, more pronounced peaks, and also the diffusion. Look at Jalisco and Michoacán, they get covered. So there are different trends of violence that not only explain the escalation, but the contagion, the spatial contagion of violence. And those happen in territories that are along the northern border, which are strategic territories for the entry routes. Also along the Pacific route, these are production areas over here, and these are also reception territories. And this is actually a very interesting point because here you have the Mexican Gulf, which is easy to get from overseas, and also very quickly, La Frontera Chica, access to Texas. So these are very strategic territories to control. Also something that we can expect from the theory. This is something that I want to present for the first time. This data is not public yet. But based on the information that I developed with the database, I'm creating this public good because no one has this data, not even the Mexican government. I wanted to put it out there. And this is violence among criminal organizations using Google Maps. So now you can zoom in like this or zoom out. Let's zoom out a little bit. You can play with the slider the different events by month. But most importantly, you can aggregate the data to see how this new blood is being shed over an already existing cemetery. And you can see how violence starts diffusing and becoming more intense in Mexico. So by December 2010, we see a lot of violence concentrating in many different areas, here, over here. And you can now get a counter over here of how many people got killed in that month and what is the cumulative count of violence in every location. And eventually you can get all the information from every municipality. So there are some things that we can do with this data that I can just not analyze it all at once. It's so much data that it's better to put it out there so a lot more people can use their brain power to find out new ways of solving this problem. How do I get back to this again? We also see some other trends, worrying trends. Oops. Sorry about that. Okay, come on. These are the number of municipalities where I detected some presence of criminal organizations. After 2007, we see a spike of territorial expansion by large criminal organizations. These are the old big guys. But then also we see the emergence of new, more violent, more aggressive, younger criminal organizations. Some of these are spin-offs of now broken larger cartels. They break down and they become more aggressive and they try to fight their way in to control territories. One of those groups, this is the same graph, just by breaking the organization by the main criminal organizations. The most violent is this red one, which is this one over here. Is the one expanding more rapidly and more aggressively. The Zetas, the story of this criminal organization is that the Mexican army in 2007 created a military elite. They got trained in the U.S. in counterinsurgency tactics to fight criminal organizations. They went out after them. But in the middle of the road, they said, like, we know this business, and it's actually pretty profitable. So they switched sides and became the bodyguards of, at the time, the most prominent drug lord, which is Osorio Cárdenas. And these guys know how the army operates. They know everything about that, and they know how to evade it. And these guys are not only drug traffickers, they are specialists of violence. And they're controlling many other different illicit sectors beyond just the drug trafficking. They're controlling prostitution, gambling, piracy, any kind of illicit sector, they're controlling that by force. So by trying to crack criminals, you created this new monster, this wilder, more violent beast that now is controlling larger sectors of the territory. And the problem is when these territories overlap. This is La Familia Michoacana with their stronghold over here in Michoacán. Now, this is where we see now the emergence of autodefensas, vigilante groups. That also overlaps with Sinaloa, Tijuana. They have their stronghold over here, of course, in Tijuana, but they control many other parts of the territory. Juárez cartel in Juárez, in the city of Juárez and Chihuahua, and also presence in Sinaloa. And this is the Golfo, this organization previously led by Osorio Cárdenas. And when he got arrested, the Zetas became independent, but also overlap in that territory. Again, this is the recipe of disaster when you have these overlapping criminal organizations in one territorial, valuable territory, and the state is moving in, disrupting them, and creating all these opportunities for violence. That is calling for new forms of violence. When the government is breaking down criminal organizations, they lose their ability to transfer drugs from Colombia because now they don't have those connections. They don't have these pilots who are flying the airplanes. But they still have their military power. So instead of getting money from drug trafficking internationally, they use their military skills and the capability of conducting violence and become now predatory against the societies that were hosting them before. So instead of making the money from drugs, now they're making the money from kidnapping, extortion, and human trafficking. Now they're capturing these migrants that come from South America. They capture them, kidnap them, make extortion go down. If their families in Central America don't pay, they just kill them. There was a big scandal of 72 migrants being killed by the Zetas in Tamaulipas. So now criminals are shifting their way of operating in a more violent way. They need to make money somehow because that's the only thing they can do. And they just do that by using violence now against their communities. That is also creating problems from state violence. A lot of people say, state, you have to do whatever is necessary to provide security. If you have to violate human rights, go for it. Kill everyone and ask questions later. This is the number of complaints of human rights abuses starting from 2006, 2007, and it's being skyrocketing. There's a lot of torture being used by the state in trying to extract information that usually is never valuable for operational intelligence, but they're just using violence against anyone. There's this new legal provision called hold arraigo. Every citizen, when you're arrested, there's someone making a charge against you. Well, the hold is basically taking anyone, putting that person without a charge, securing that person for 2 months in a security house where they usually get tortured and are forced to sign a fake confession to present some charges. So the hold is basically violating all civil rights and the legal procedures. Now anyone can just point a finger on you, they will arrest you, and they will put you in custody for 2 months until they find out a reason to start a legal process against you. So these are all the brutality that now the state is doing to provide security to citizens who are demanding that. As a reaction, we see society that is not protected by the state, but harassed by the state, also harassed by criminals that are now predatories against their societies. And now we see the emergence of self-defense forces. This is a recent project I've been working on, applying this same project, this same software, but instead of coding violence among criminals, I'm trying to track the emergence of vigilante groups in Mexico. When societies are so violated and so harassed, and there's no one there to protect them, well, they take guns and they take justice with their own hands and arm up themselves. And this is what we see in Michoacán, which is the hotspot of vigilante groups, and also this is Guerrero. There are two different kinds of vigilante groups. These ones are reacting against criminal organizations. This state has a very long history of insurgencies. The insurgencies in Mexico in the 60s and the 70s that radicalized from Mexico City, they seek refuge over here in Guerrero and in Chiapas. Chiapas is the Zapatista rebellion. Guerrero is the house of EPR, Ejército Popular, the Popular Army, the People's Revolutionary Army. The state is being friendly to these guys and allowing them a lot of concessions, but still being very repressive against these pro-insurgent self-defense forces. Now we're seeing the creation, the emergence of new self-defense forces that is just preamble of what we saw in Colombia that eventually escalated in such a way that in Colombia they had the similar process at the beginning. There were so many self-defense forces that they created the Federation of Self-Defense Forces. And eventually they became so brutal. And they just obey paramilitary groups, not the government. And the government is using them to conduct these horrible massacres when they just wipe out entire villages. Again, this is calling for a new animal that was not existing in Mexico. And it's very dangerous. There's a lot of people say, yeah, if the state is not protecting them, they have the right to protect themselves. Well, that makes sense. But then what comes after that? The emergence of new groups here, everywhere. These are outside of the law. They are not sanctioned. They are not controlled. They are not trained. And when they grow so large, they can be very dangerous to society as well. In addition, we also have these massive waves of social unrest, starting with Movimiento por la Paz, a peaceful movement organized by this very famous poet, a Mexican poet his son got killed by criminal organizations, and he organized a large-scale movement. Actually, they even marched all the way to D.C. to present their claims. Most recently, there was a big tragedy, the tragedy of the students in Ayotzinapa, Guerrero, in the south, where a group of teacher students in the teachers' college, normalistas, they got kidnapped by police officers. They were handed to a criminal group, and this criminal group, they were told that these were their rivals. The police lied to them to basically get them killed. And it was a very brutal event. There are video recordings of police cars with all the students loaded, just being moved away from the city, from the scene. This launched a huge political crisis that now is going on in Mexico, calling a lot of broad support from society to contest the security policies implemented by the state. In addition, that's being the trigger, the spark that is creating all this fire also about many other different types of social unrest and social discomfort, pretty much associated with a broken economy. We have this new president is trying to create a very nice political discourse that everything is fine in Mexico when all this violence is going pretty much put under the rug. But this is going on and people are so fed up with it. This government's trying to create this idea of a new progressive Mexico, passing all these reforms, labor, fiscal, energy reforms, but still is turning a blind eye on the security problem, which is now so explosive that it's calling the attention of the population, and people are organizing. We see these large-scale social movements, not only in Mexico City, but in many other states, and also internationally. There was this this soccer match between Mexico and the Netherlands, and students were protesting internationally on that. In the minute 43, the soccer match has 45 minutes, so pretty much at the end of the game, they all showed up signs. So this is now causing a lot more social instability and problems that are adding up to the already enhanced political and security crisis. So conclusion, in order to control the beast, we have to understand it. This is a very complex process that includes large-scale structural factors, international, economic, drug production, drug prices, supply of weapons, economic crisis globally that is also having an effect locally. It also has to do with local politics, local geographics in Mexico, demographics, local economics. And also, if you go more at the micro level, it has a lot to do with the microdynamics of violence, of the state cracking down criminal organizations, creating this opportunity of territorial violence that is now creating this wave of violence among criminals. This is a very complex problem that is not going to have an easy solution. But one of the important things to keep in mind is that most of this is driven by the huge economic profits. No one is killing or willing to die to buy a bottle of wine in a liquor store. Not anymore. That happened in Chicago in the 20s. That sector got legalized because of the violence that was created. But this is something that is not happening at this time. There are some processes of some efforts in trying to legalize marijuana, but marijuana is a very small share of the market for criminal organizations. It is between 16 and 25% of their income. The big chunk of it is coming from cocaine. There are no efforts, no political discussion about legalizing cocaine, not even to mention heroin, because that triggers a lot of political and moral issues that have nothing to do with the economics behind these highly profitable markets. And if you still have those 25% of the global drug market being placed in this country, then someone is also willing to kill and die for providing this huge demand for drugs. And the problem is that it does not come easy. Such a complex process, if you try to create law enforcement, then this law enforcement is going to create a lot more violence. So what do? You don't go after them? But then that's a problem too, right? So there's a political conundrum here. So that's going to create a lot of escalation of criminal organizations, violence among them. Some people say that the problem of Mexico is not drug trafficking. It's definitely not drug consumption. The levels of consumption in Mexico are very small. The problem of Mexico is violence created by these criminal organizations. And the priority should be to deter violence. If stopping a shipment of drugs in Mexico is creating violence, well, don't stop that shipment of drugs. So you deter violence. Of course, that is not a politically viable policy that the Mexican government will say, yeah, I like that. And the US is going to say, like, no, you don't like that at all. Right? Now we see these new types of predatory behavior that now we have to control and deal with. Extortion, kidnapping, these forms of violence that were not there before, and also these new political and violent actors, non-state actors such as the vigilante groups. And pretty much is not too much to say about democracy, in which this is one of the biggest disappointments, right? You wanted for 70 years to create a democratic state, to have competition among different levels of government, to have cleaner politicians who are not corrupted and who are harder on crime. But having that is breaking this pact, long-standing pact between criminals and politicians that allowed stability. Mexico was corrupt but peaceful. Now there are some process of cleaning the corruption, but it's creating all this violence. And a lot of people say, you know what? You better deal with this in any way that is necessary. If you have to go back to those political agreements with criminals, go for it, as long as we have security. So what is the end of it? If in the effort of having democracy in the country, you created unintendedly this escalation of violence by cracking down on criminal organizations, some people now want the old way of dealing with the system that we had before. But now this is also another element of the erosion of democracy. And with that, I thank you.